Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about the crisis in Venezuela. Specifically, I'm going to talk about it as a case study for how hyperinflation occurs. We're going to see an example of how trade and exchange rate dynamics that I've been talking about in my recent videos can actually be really important in determining the path of an economy. Speaking of, I just want to make sure, did you watch my last two videos? Especially the most recent one about trade patterns and exchange rates? If not, I very strongly recommend that you make yourself familiar with those concepts because today is going to be all about that in a real world example. So, this topic of hyperinflation really is fascinating, but it comes up far too often in conversations about government policy. A big part of the reason that I'm making a video on this topic is that I want to do my part to dispel a pretty common and quite harmful misconception about hyperinflation. Namely, I want to show you that a country is not in danger of hyperinflation simply because it has high debt or a high budget deficit. In other words, government spending money, even lots of money, on social policies does not turn a country into Venezuela. Rather, it is better to think of hyperinflation as something like gunpowder. It has several very specific ingredients that all need to be present and combined in the right way before a match is lit. If you don't have all of those ingredients, as well as a spark to set them off, there will be no explosion. By the end of this video, if I do my job well, I think you will see what I mean. But it's going to take some time to get through everything. This video is going to be a little bit longer than usual, so let's just get started. Okay, first off, hyperinflation is not just really bad inflation. People tend to want to think about it in simple terms, like hyperinflation is what happens when you get too much inflation and you lose control. But it's just not the case. Hyperinflation and your normal everyday inflation are totally different animals. First off, hyperinflation is way more extreme, like not even comparable. Like, it's impossible to solidly, strictly define what counts as hyperinflation, but ever since the 1950s, economists generally start to call it hyperinflation when you exceed a monthly inflation rate of 50%. That is equal to an annual inflation rate of just under 13,000%. Now, the peak monthly inflation rate in Venezuela, our primary subject for today, was around 230 to 240%, but that doesn't even come close to some other examples from the last century. The world record is currently held by Hungary, which in July of 1946 hit a monthly inflation rate of almost 42 quadrillion percent. You heard me right, I said quadrillion, with 15 zeros. Compared to that, an annual inflation rate of 13.5%, the peak rate in the US at the end of the super high inflation 1970s, seems quaint. Now, the highest monthly rate that the US had in that period was in March of 1980 at only about 1.5%. In fact, especially when we look at developing countries, an annual inflation rate of 20% or more might seem a little bit high, but it doesn't really trigger any alarms for economists. In fact, sometimes in those developing contexts, it might even be a sign that things are going really well. The point I'm trying to make here is that countries don't just gradually move from a 0.5% monthly inflation rate up to 50% or more and somehow lose control along the way. There's a huge gap between those two. The high hyperinflation numbers often come suddenly, resulting from something totally unrelated to the normal causes of inflation. Now, I know I haven't made a video yet talking about normal inflation and what causes it, but you really don't need to know that to understand hyperinflation. Inflation, generally speaking, is an amorphous phenomenon with tons of different potential causes, but hyperinflation is caused entirely by what I talked about in my previous videos: international trade and exchange rates. So remember last time when I talked about how exchange rates change based on how much of each currency is being exchanged for each other currency. If I use lots of dollars to buy lots of euros, but nobody does the same thing in reverse, then the value of the dollar goes down relative to the euro and the price that I have to pay to get euros goes up. Well, hyperinflation happens when your country has, practically speaking, no choice but to buy and spend lots of foreign currency, and no other foreign countries want to buy anywhere near as much of your own currency. Got it? No? That's fine. Let's keep going, and hopefully you'll start to see what I mean. So Venezuela. Venezuela is an oil rentier state. A rentier state is a country where the government gets a large portion of its revenue from economic rents. That is, the value of stuff that it owns and sells to foreigners. For Venezuela, as for many other rentier states around the world, that stuff that it owns and sells is its oil reserves. The government owns it, the government sells it to foreign buyers. Simple. Now, Venezuela is one of the original founding members of OPEC, and while it is not the world's largest oil producer, and we'll start to see why that is later, it does have the world's largest oil reserves. Along with other major oil rentier states, such as Iran and Saudi Arabia, this fact about Venezuela materializes in some fairly predictable ways. One of the most important implications is that a government which relies on selling oil for its revenue doesn't have to worry so much about tax revenue. Now, some rentier states, like Saudi Arabia, might just choose not to have any income tax at all. But even countries which do have income taxes, like Iran and indeed Venezuela, they don't have to worry so much about how much money they get from those taxes. Now, the authors of this paper estimate that oil sales accounted for over 60% of government revenue in Venezuela prior to the start of their crisis. By contrast, the U.S. Office of Management and Budget estimates that individual and corporate income taxes, along with payroll taxes, which are also tied to individual income, made up over 90% of U.S. government revenue in 2019. So, if a government like the US government wants to increase their revenue without raising taxes or adding new taxes, which usually makes voters angry, the best way for them to do that is to find a way to get incomes to go up. More income means more income taxes, which means more government revenue. Similarly, lower incomes means less tax revenue. What this means in the end is that the US government has a strong budgetary incentive to maintain and improve the health of the economy overall. Venezuela, on the other hand, has another option. They can just sell more oil. Now, technically, producing and selling more oil is an improvement to the economy through an increase in economic activity. However, even ignoring the environmental aspects of it, the problem is that just extracting and then exporting it has basically no connection to the rest of the local economy. Not only is the product not sold locally, but the equipment and everything needed to produce it is typically not made locally. The effect is that it gives the government lots of money in foreign currencies, which they can just then use to import whatever it needs or wants and can't get in Venezuela. And that's not that surprising. That's generally how big exports work, regardless of whether the money goes through the government or through private banks. But the difference with the oil case is that this is huge exports which have very little to do with what the Venezuelan economy is able to produce for itself. It is largely disconnected from the country's broader level of economic development. Economists have a term for this kind of situation. We call it Dutch disease. I'll let you Google that if you want to know where the name comes from, but it's basically what happens when a country becomes so dependent on exporting a natural resource that it just doesn't invest enough in improving or even maintaining other important parts of the economy. It's kind of the economics version of a serious substance abuse addiction. Now, most countries only get big increases to exports by developing a large manufacturing industry capable of producing all kinds of things, from food products to machinery and so on. The economic diversity that comes from this approach ensures the existence of good hedging positions in case one product or the other becomes non-viable, as well as a broad base of productive knowledge and efficiency, which can then be applied to all kinds of economic activity. Basically, it gives you lots of options by forcing you to upgrade technologically. See my video about low-wage countries for more on that. Oil rentier states, however, they can get huge export numbers without doing any of that. All they have to do is sell more oil or be able to charge more money for the oil they're already selling. Now, this doesn't require any significant amount of technological development. The result of this is a country which has a relatively high standard of living considering its economic structure and level of development. And that high standard of living is based largely on how much of a single natural resource that it can sell. How does that story end? Well, we all know that you shouldn't put all of your eggs in one basket. That same paper that I mentioned earlier estimated that oil accounted for close to 90% of Venezuela's exports. OPEC's website today claims that it is 99% of Venezuela's exports. Now, that's what you might call a non-diversified portfolio. But also, if you know anything about commodities markets, you will know that oil has an extremely volatile price. Once you start to understand that both the country's trade balance and its government revenue were hugely dependent on the sales of a single volatile commodity, you begin to understand that Venezuela was really a ticking time bomb. So Venezuela was in bad shape before hyperinflation started. And this is because the government had long ago fallen prey to the temptations of the resource curse and had developed a case of Dutch disease, which was slowly getting worse. Then the government of Hugo Chavez put it into overdrive. It's important for us to recognize that the mistakes of the Chavez government were not in implementing expensive social policies. Rather, their mistakes were in implementing those expensive social policies which were exclusively 100% accounted for by national oil sales. There was also some general poor management and implementation of what might have otherwise been good programs, but we'll get there in good time. See, Chavez was lucky. He entered office at the end of the 1990s, a terrible decade for Venezuela filled with massive recessions, low oil prices, and high and growing poverty. But a year after he took office, oil prices skyrocketed. Now this was largely even his fault, as the Chavez government was instrumental in lobbying the rest of OPEC to stick to very strict production quotas in order to increase prices globally. But still, the fact is, he suddenly had huge stacks of money, the likes of which Venezuela hadn't seen since the 1970s. Then, after a decade of economic deterioration, he gave that money to the people, ignoring the fact that there was really not much for them to buy with it. Now, many people in Venezuela, even then, were poor and found it difficult to afford basic necessities, like food. This was partly due to the fact that Venezuela has never been agriculturally independent. They have always needed to import much, if not most, of what people eat. And this means that how much money they get from oil sales makes a big difference in how expensive food is. Because if they can sell a lot of oil, then that means the currency gets stronger and imports become cheaper, and that means they can import more food for less money. Even when oil prices were low, oil exports still made food imports so cheap, and the oil industry made rural wages so high, that investing in agriculture was simply not economically viable. And in the long term, that caused food production in the country to fall consistently, even throughout the 90s. So, when oil prices rose and food prices fell even further, Chavez implemented price controls to keep food cheap. Then he gave people the money that they needed to buy it. When oil prices fell again soon after that, this led to shortages as the amount of food decreased since it became more expensive to import. People kept buying the same amount though, since prices and incomes hadn't changed. So there wasn't enough to go around. All the while, domestic food production continued to decline. This is why the country started to see shortages as early as 2005, long before any hyperinflation had occurred. Then there was the problem of capital flight. Before Chavez, there had been a lot of foreign money invested in Venezuela, and not just in the oil industry. Now, whether or not you think that kind of foreign investment should happen or that money should have been there, the fact is it was, and the economy that existed was built in part on that foundation. Now, Chavez certainly didn't want to drive this money away, which we know because he later tried to stop it from leaving. But he did a few things which scared it off. First, one of his main campaign promises was to stop and reverse industrial privatization, especially in the oil industry, but more generally as well. Next, he advocated for a new constitution that basically copy-pasted Fidel Castro's reforms of the Cuban legislature. Then, in 2000, he pushed a referendum to force all labor unions in the country to hold new elections controlled by his government. Now, regardless of the intentions or the immediate effects of these actions, what it did was it made businesses worry, because it seemed to follow a predictable pattern. There was a lot of fear at the time that Venezuela was headed towards a communist dictatorship, and that private businesses would ultimately be appropriated by the government. Now, no matter what you think about that, whether you think it's good or bad, the result of it in the short term is very predictable. Nobody wants to make an investment when they think that there's a good chance that someone, in this case the government, might just take it away from them and there's nothing they can do about it. So two things happen. One, foreign investors leave and they don't come back. And two, Venezuelans with money try to leave, or at least put their money into other countries. Both of these mean that people are taking Venezuelan currency, bolivares, that they own and trying to use it to buy other currencies. And the fact that most of this currency exchange was trying to get US dollars, while the US was simultaneously Venezuela's biggest trading partner, meant that the impact on the cost of imports and the country's ability to import what it needed was as big as it possibly could have been. Now, on the oil front, following a general strike in 2002 to 2003, the government replaced 40% of its own oil workers. And since these were probably some of the more experienced oil workers in the economy, this is not a good sign for productivity. They also took this opportunity to reorganize the state oil company and made it easier to use its profits directly on social programs. While this was a benefit in the short term for the poor of Venezuela, it was done in a careless way. The state took so much money out of the company's profits, there wasn't enough left to reinvest into maintenance and production, which ultimately meant that the country's oil production infrastructure slowly started to atrophy. Another important event is in 2001, the government started to enact land reform, with the intention of redistributing unused land to the poor in order to finally make Venezuela food independent. And honestly, as far as socialist land reforms go, it really wasn't even very extreme. Initially, they were only redistributing government-owned land, but even after they started to redistribute private land in 2005, it was still restricted to unused land, and they also still had to compensate the old owners at fair market prices. The problem with this program was that there was very little oversight, which meant lots of corruption and black market land sales, as well as little to no support for the new farmers, who were often unable to transport or sell what little they were able to produce. And thanks to the oil exports that this was all based on, food imports remained cheaper than anything that the farmers could offer. The real kicker, though, is actually kind of ironic. In the face of declining oil revenues, increased necessity of imports, and capital flight, Venezuela started to experience pretty high inflation thanks to the worsening exchange rates and, thus, higher cost of necessary imports. Although there had been some improvement in the early Chavez years, likely driven by the really high oil prices, things started getting worse by 2003, and conditions returned to almost exactly the same as they had been during the awful 90s. The economy was shrinking, and inflation was steady at about 30% annually for the next decade. Note, we are still way short of anything that can be called hyperinflation. But still, the government was worried about this inflation and wanted to make sure that imports stayed cheap, so in 2003 they implemented strict capital controls. Essentially, they established an agency that controlled all currency exchange, dictated fixed exchange rates below market rates, and essentially made it cheap but almost impossible to get foreign currency. This was meant to slow inflation by stopping the capital flight that I mentioned earlier, but it had exactly the opposite effect. As we know from the history of prohibition around the world, whether it's prohibition of drugs, alcohol, prostitution, gambling, you name it, if a government makes consenting economic activity illegal, it often only accomplishes the creation of a black market. Of course, this happens with currency exchange as well. The government created an agency that offered the only legal way to trade currency, and it pegged the bolivar to the US dollar at a fixed exchange rate. The problem with this strategy is that people still value the dollar at a higher price in bolivares, even if you refuse to trade at that higher price. So, people won't want to use dollars to buy bolivares because they don't think that they're getting a fair deal, which means that the dollars that you have available are severely limited. And because of that, you don't have the supply for all of the people who want to buy dollars at your fixed low price. And therefore, you have to be very selective about who you give those dollars to. So naturally, the government prioritizes people who are trying to import the important things, like food and equipment. But people would lie. Sometimes people would claim that their imports cost more than they actually did. Sometimes they wouldn't even import anything at all. And people found many ways to cheat and use dollars differently from how they said that they would. These people who cheated the system would often just turn around and sell dollars on the black market for a tidy profit at what is effectively a black market exchange rate, or officially we refer to it as a parallel exchange rate. All of this grift and corruption meant that many legitimate importers simply wouldn't be able to get through the bureaucracy to acquire the dollars that they needed, which meant that they couldn't actually import those important things, like food, especially not at the prices that the government said that they should be able to. Even without the cheating, there still probably would have been some shortages due to a simple lack of foreign currency. Now, these problems started off small, but they got worse and worse over time as the central bank was forced to repeatedly devalue the bolivar. In 2008, they introduced a new currency, the Bolivar Fuerte, literally the strong bolivar, worth 1,000 of the original bolivares. But even in the black market, the exchange rate hadn't even doubled by then. So we're still nowhere near hyperinflation, and things still aren't that bad, all things considered. This change to the Bolivar Fuerte was mostly just done to make accounting easier. But then, later that same year, we had a global financial crisis. Yet, it hurt everyone. But Venezuela, they made their money by selling oil, and everybody still needed oil, right? The price of oil did collapse temporarily, but it quickly, very quickly, recovered to levels well above even the pre-crisis prices. The true crisis for Venezuela came years later in 2014 and 2015. Now, it's not important for this video to know exactly why it happened, but at that time, oil prices were suddenly halved and then some. Even today, the price of oil still hasn't recovered to the levels seen before 2014. Now remember that any economic stability that Venezuela had was based almost entirely on how many dollars they could get by selling oil. And then suddenly, seemingly overnight, that dollar supply was cut in half, literally. The imports of food and equipment on which the country depended became less and less available. Exchange rates rose faster and faster as Venezuelan exports, i.e. oil, fell in value, and foreign countries just didn't need as many bolivares to buy them. And this problem only gets worse as the lack of money forces the government to piecemeal shut down its oil operations and slow down oil production. All the while, they keep trying to fix exchange rates, perpetuating the existence of a currency black market, further harming the ability to legitimately import the basic items that the people needed to survive. Eventually, in 2018, they introduced another new currency, the Bolivar Soberano, literally the sovereign Bolivar, worth 100,000 of the Bolivar Fuerte that they had introduced previously. But even that is starting to become unmanageable today, only 3 years later. Starting in 2017 and 2018, Venezuela began defaulting on its debt because it was denominated in US dollars or euros, not in bolivares, and it simply could not get the dollars or the euros that it needed in order to pay it. This was certainly not helped by then US President Donald Trump signing an executive order in 2017 preventing the trading of Venezuelan debt within the US and, by extension, preventing any kind of debt restructuring. The default created an increased perception of risk on the part of investors, which further compounded the difficulty of bringing in any foreign currency. Then 2019 saw the sanctions against the state oil company and even non-Venezuelan shipping companies that simply moved Venezuelan oil to Cuba. This further hindered the country's ability to sell its only export. And later that same year, the US imposed a full embargo, and that brings us basically to today. Venezuelan oil revenues are extremely low by historical standards, which means that the food imports that it needs are incredibly expensive, and getting more expensive by the day. So yes, there were some problems that had existed for a long time, but the path towards Venezuelan hyperinflation really began in 2014 with the collapse of oil prices. Inflation suddenly jumped from a high, but not terribly unusual, 20 to 30% annually, to the highest in the world at over 60% annually. Hyperinflation officially began at the end of 2016, when the monthly rate topped 50% and stayed high. It has dropped below that many times since, but never consistently. Today, the Venezuelan hyperinflation episode is generally considered to be ongoing. Ultimately, the cause of Venezuelan hyperinflation is not even debated among economists. We all know what it was. It wasn't communism or socialism. It wasn't the government spending too much money on its people. Instead, it was the government building its entire economy on oil exports while neglecting basically everything else. They created a situation where they needed to import to survive. And then suddenly, for reasons that they couldn't entirely control, they just could no longer export enough to afford it. Now, every case of hyperinflation differs somewhat on the details, but this aspect is common throughout. You might hear some people try to tell you that hyperinflation happens because the government prints money with wild abandon. While that printing of money does become a practical necessity once you're in the grips of hyperinflation, it is not the cause. Rather than the supply of your own currency, it really has far more to do with the supply of and your need for foreign currencies. Now, if you want to know how to solve hyperinflation, that's a much more difficult question to answer. Any simple, direct solution is likely to be even more painful than the hyperinflation itself. You can't really solve it until and unless you can address the underlying issues, which in this case is largely the country's insufficient agricultural production. But solving that without the Venezuelan people starving in the meantime is going to take time, really good policy making and management, and also a lot of foreign aid. But as of right now, the human tragedy is happening because Venezuela is just not getting that. Now, hopefully I've given you something to think about. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next time.